illuminating topic, law and grace, 500 years later. Please help yourself to some refreshments. There's coffee, water up here. There are snacks on the tables over there. Anybody that needs a bathroom, if you go through this door right here, walk down the hall and take a right. The men's is on the left and the women's is on the right. Let's open with a prayer. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Heavenly Father, thank you for the gift of your Son, our Lord Jesus Christ, and the good news, the gospel message that his apostles proclaimed after he was known to be risen from the dead, that God's love is known to us apart from anything that we do to earn or deserve that abundant grace which God pours upon us through his Holy Spirit. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Well, you know you're at a distinguished event when the introducer has someone introduce them. So now I'm going to turn things over to Nick.
Well, it's my honor and privilege to introduce this evening's speaker. I had the pleasure of getting to know Dave. We were both working in campus ministry in Charlottesville for a short time. Our work kind of overlapped, and so we got a chance to know one another. Actually, he reached out to me and introduced himself to me, and we would get together for lunch, and I thought, well, this is a nice guy. I'll get together with him. Maybe we can work together. And all the while, what I didn't realize is that he was nationally known, maybe internationally known, blogger and speaker and podcaster, the founder and director of the Mockingbird Ministries, which you can find at www.mbird.com. Mockingbird Ministry, from their website, they say, is a ministry that seeks to connect the Christian faith with the realities of everyday life in fresh and down-to-earth ways. I think they do that exceptionally well, and particularly Dave has been able to do that very well. So in addition to being the founder and director of that, he also works in a parish at Christ Church in Charlottesville, where he's a lay preacher and he does campus ministry. And somehow he's able to juggle all of this and family life. But I commend the Mockingbird website to you. Also, you should know that he's published. He's got articles in Christianity Today, like the one he has in the special issue just for the 500 years of Reformation. He is the author of A Mess of Help from the Crucified Soul of Rock and Roll, and co-author of Law and Gospel, a Theology for Sinners and Saints. And I think there are actually 3 copies of this, but a limited few in the back, so don't trample each other trying to get to that. But there are also copies of the Mockingbird, the physical journal, right, back there that you can pick up. Anyway, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce David Zahl.
Thank you. Just 1 second here for the 21st century.
Wait, Nick, how do I look, everyone? Star Trek?
Martin Luther had one of these. Just think of where we'd be. Or don't. Thank you to Nick for having me, and for Connor for welcoming me. It's really fun to be here. As Nick said, I live in Charlottesville, so I'm not far away, and I work with there's a lot of refugees from Richmond that show up in Charlottesville. Just our rector grew up and went to Freeman and did the whole thing, and I think he's happy to not live here. So I know that's not everyone's experience. I know that most of my students actually that come here from Richmond just absolutely love it, and it's really fun to be some involvement in the wider Diocese of Virginia. So yes, we did. I did bring some copies of our magazine and some books. I got a fair warning, though. Those are the magazines that have been sent back for whatever reason because we had the wrong address. They're a little dinged up. So apologies in advance, but that's why they're free. So I figured that was better than nothing, right? I wanted to begin tonight by showing you my new favorite toy. Can anyone see this? I'm going to let you pass it around. We can open it up and all play with it together. So if you get bored, take a look. What this is the fastest selling Playmobil in history. It came out 2 years ago. It is a little Playmobil that maybe your children played with, or maybe you currently play with. German toys, and it's Martin Luther. It's a little Martin Luther with a little beret and a little New Testament. Or actually, it's both the Old Testament and the New Testament. And he's also got a quill in here somewhere. And they did one of Albrecht Dürer as well, who's a great, Reformation painter. This doesn't look like Martin Luther. I think he was known to be a much more substantial human being, shall we say. But it's a toy, and I thought you'd have fun with it because or using it as my sort of opening device. So here you can pass it around, and if nothing else, you got to play with a toy tonight. So yes, in 2015, it was completely unexpected when the Playmobil, the German toy company, released this figure, and it sold out in record time. I mean, who knew anyone cared anymore about Martin Luther? It was, you wouldn't think that this would have happened, and yet it flew off the shelves. It was the fastest selling figurine in the company's 40-year history. Just a side note, my parents wouldn't allow us to have Playmobil because they said it was the quintessential toy that you played with once and never touched again. So get them Legos, and I sort of followed suit with my boys, except for these. I have a little stash of them. They're a little army of Martin Luthers they can play with. So I think it was actually sort of ironic that, and this is, I'm drawing a lot on my article I wrote in Christianity Today about the 500th anniversary. It was quite ironic that the figurine sold so well. It was not the first time that Martin Luther had been at the collision between demand and expectation and gift. A lot of pastors got that as a gift. A lot of Lutheran pastors especially. Maybe not a lot of Episcopalians, but some Lutherans did receive it, maybe more than they would have liked. But I think that this time, the stakes, of course, are just silly. The 500th anniversary is we think of it as maybe a historical curiosity, and we wonder, what does it have to do with today? The Reformation has fallen in and out of vogue many times since it occurred, and maybe we all have heard good things about Martin Luther, and you've probably heard some not so good things about Martin Luther over the years. His writings and his writings about later in life, of course, about his Jewish brothers and sisters were not very charitable, and yet the stakes that were raised by his theology, in my view, continue to be quite high. I'm glad you're putting it together. Yeah. I like this crowd.
She only has 10 of them.
You have 10 of them?
I ordered 10 of them.
Oh, I hear a German accent. I like it. Now, what do I mean when I say that the stakes raised by Luther's theology continue to be quite high, despite the kitsch and the frivolity and maybe the arcane nature that sometimes we view a German monk from 1517. Why would I say that? Well, a few years ago, in response to a spate of suicides on its campus, maybe you know this, the University of Pennsylvania put together a task force to explore the mental health of its students. This has actually made a lot of national headlines. The problem, they're called suicide clusters in very high-achieving populations in Palo Alto, California, in Greenwich, Connecticut, on Ithaca, New York. Places like this, kids are under so much pressure that there's something called a suicide cluster that is occurring, where you'll have 6 instances of self-harm like that, and it'll rock a campus, and officials and caregivers don't know what to do, because where is this coming from? We seem to have so much figured out and so much material comfort. Why on earth would a young, promising student whose posts on Facebook seem to paint a picture of idyllic, co-ed engagement in life, why would they have a secret despair that they would address in this way? Well, what the task force at UPenn found was tragic, but not actually that surprising to those who are aware of Luther's understanding of human nature and the forces that we live under as people in a broken world. They found that the, quote, pressures engendered by the perception that one has to be perfect in every academic, co-curricular, and social endeavor can lead to stress, and in some cases distress. And in turn, that distress can manifest as demoralization, alienation, and conditions like anxiety and depression. For some students, mental illness can actually lead to suicide. Now, I do not mean to suggest even remotely that mental health, mental illness can be reduced to social circumstances. We all know that it is there's a physiological component that's undeniable. However, sociologists would not be doing their job if they did not examine the specific factors that are going into this phenomenon that is so tragic and involving so many of our young people. And especially, frankly, young people that grew up going to, Episcopal churches, for lack of a better word. This is not something that's happening in low-income neighborhoods. It's happening among usually high-achieving, middle-class, upper-middle-class white people. Those are the demographics that are most at risk for this kind of self-harm. It's not a very glamorous statistic, of course. But the mercilessness that is described by these students and by this task force as being present on grounds, I say that on grounds, on campus, that's Charlottesville slang for on campus. It's experienced not just by college students. It is actually experienced by almost everyone today, and maybe always in every time. But there's something about the way that technology and the pace of life have come together in our current situation, in which people feel like they're in a pressure cooker and the pace is getting out of life is sort of barreling out of control. This is for people who are interested in addressing a spiritual problem, or at least taking the spiritual temperature of our neighbors. This is a very, very real phenomenon. The pressure to perform, to make something of oneself, to become acceptable, to make a difference in the world, to justify one's existence, is sort of off the charts, and it's producing a lot of really exhausted human beings. And I think not just exhausted human beings, but discouraged human beings. It's a phenomenon that tends to cast people back in on themselves. If you're constantly worried about how you're performing, how you're stacking up next to this person on social media, or that person, next to whose Christmas letter you got, that means you're constantly going to be taking your own temperature. How am I doing now? How am I doing now? What about this year? What about that year? You're always going to be focused on yourself. These kind of pressures do throw us back on ourselves, and when we falter in some irreversible way, and one thing we know about life in the internet age is that if you make a mistake, it's out there. Sometimes one of the things, if you read the news coverage, and the New York Times is always talking about it, and the American Scholar had an incredible article about it recently, but there's a lot of unrest on campuses, and a lot of activism, and a lot of people really getting in a lot of trouble. It's not a happy place right now, and maybe it's a little. I don't mean to sound alarmist in any way, but one thing you find out is that what we forget is that these are just 19-year-old kids, and who here didn't make a big mistake when they were 19, and yet was it recorded for everyone to see and put down so that it would come up when your future employers picked it up? oh, so-and-so got arrested for underage drinking in 1971. They're not going to get a job now in 2017. I mean, these are the sort of things. It's to the point where people feel like maybe you have to change your name in order to outrun infractions in your past. So why am I talking about this in terms of the Reformation? Well, what we're talking about is the pressure to perform, is the pressure to justify your existence. And when we talk about justification, are you justified? Have you made something of yourself? Well, then you are dealing with the precise theological existential problem that Martin Luther was dealing with. In his, I'm speaking sort of broadly here, but I do want to paint the context for you, because if you're not aware of what Luther actually did, I ask my students, who's Martin Luther to you? What do they say? They say 95 Theses. Some of them say 95 Theses while trying to create 95 Feces. It's a terrible thing. Don't repeat it to anyone, and don't act like I've said it. But he's known as sort of like there's a lot of dirty, I don't know where I came to about that. But he's not, they tell you about his writings about, usually they will talk about anti-Semitism. They'll talk to you about indulgences, because that's what the 95 Theses were originally sort of dealing with, were the problem of indulgences, which was the problem of the Catholic Church at that time, selling pieces of paper in order to fund St. Peter's Basilica that would sort of claim to get you a part in purgatory. And this was problematic, to say the least. And of course, this one guy named Johann Tetzel was especially egregious in his strategies, in his ploys. But they never talk, almost never talk, about justification by grace through faith. Or this is the great breakthrough of the Reformation. And there are many breakthroughs, but this is the one I'm talking about tonight. It has to do with what we call justification by faith. This UPenn I've just described as justification by works, by performance, by resume, by transcript, by Facebook profile. What does it mean to be justified by faith? What was the nature of Luther's core breakthrough, and how does it actually relate today? I hope I've already laid that groundwork. Well, he was in his mid-30s, a little younger than me, which is a little daunting to report on, as you know. He was sequestered in one of the small tower rooms of his cloister, he was a monk. He was an Augustinian monk. He's hard at work on a fresh set of lectures for the university there in Wittenberg, where he serves as a lecturer in theology. But the work isn't going well. You see, he's hit a roadblock in his studies that will not yield, and it's come in the form of the first chapter of Romans. He's trying to teach a class about Paul's epistle to the Romans. And the 17th verse, specifically, has been keeping him up at night. It's been driving him crazy. This is the verse. For in the gospel the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. A lot of religious words, a lot of big words. And, even the way that I would hear that in a modern context would be completely different than how he would have heard it. And I'll tell you how he heard it. He would have been trained in the scholastic tradition, which interpreted Paul's phrase, the righteousness of God, as shorthand for the awesome holiness of God, before which sinners, like you and me, can only quail in fear. So he would have read the verse in Romans the following way. The gospel reveals that God punishes sinners, which of course is no gospel at all. I'm reducing things a little bit, but this is essentially, it terrified him and it consumed him. You see, he was what Freud called Luther a patient of great importance for Europe, and that was a kind of a condescending thing to say, but he would he had an overactive conscience. Maybe you've had a child who's got a bit of an overactive conscience. It's apologizing for things that maybe it's okay, just go out and play. I wish your brother would apologize occasionally. You need to just unwind a little bit. I have two children, and I see it. It's so funny how one of them is tightly wound and one of them's not. I don't know what we did differently. I don't think, maybe they just come out that way. Who knows? But today, he would probably be termed a neurotic, or at least a handful. Okay? You don't want, I always feel for Katerina von Bora, who he married eventually. We have a big portrait of her in our sort of small group room in our church. And I always think about this woman as being like really a saint, because he just was so internally complicated and sensitive that God gave him that, I believe, and yet it would have been tough to be married to. But whatever the root of his sensitivities were, they had driven him into the monastery, where he hoped that a life of radical service would bring him the peace with God that he craved. And he became notorious, therefore, in the monastery for spending countless hours in the confessional, trying to get right with God by unearthing every dark thought and impure motive in his heart. And if you are a self-aware person, and Martin was clearly he's often called one of the first real modern people. You know what a well, like a deep well that can be. Trying to figure out what's my motivation for this? Well, is it just to love this person, or do I also feel kind of good about it too? And is that all right if I feel good about the fact that I've just, given out this meal? Is that self-serving? And then you go deeper and deeper and deeper until all you're doing is checking your pulse constantly, right? And you're driven kind of crazy. So he found no comfort. In fact, his great confessor, he was known for saying, go out and do some real sinning so that I can give you some real forgiveness. Because I'm something like that. Father Kyle Tomlin can give us the real quote. He's much more of an expert than I am. But the deeper he dove into this system of penance and confession, the deeper his despair at pleasing God became. He would later admit that he had begun to hate God, who he felt demanded the impossible, who clobbered sinners mercilessly with his law, with his command, only to clobber them afresh with his gospel too. But this day was different. The day of the breakthrough was different. He was agonizing over the verse once again, and he received a lightning bolt of inspiration. This is how he actually described it in his own letters. He said, I grasped that the righteousness of God is that righteousness by which, through grace and sheer mercy, God justifies us through faith. Thereupon I felt myself to be reborn and have gone through open doors into paradise. In other words, a long-hoped-for assurance washed over this fretful young monk. And according to every account, his faltering love for God burst back into full flame. And it would set Europe on fire in both a beautiful way and also, as we know, with war. After 30 Years' War would eventually come, the 7 years before it. But the discovery was premised on a distinguishing between the righteousness of the law and the righteousness of the gospel, or that which can be earned by man and that which is given by God. Righteousness that is based on your transcript versus righteousness that is given to you as almost by the token of your birth, or in fact, of course, by your relationship with his son. He told friends years later, he said, I regarded both God's law and his gospel as the same thing, and held that there was no difference between Christ and Moses, except the times in which they lived and their degrees of perfection. In other words, Jesus was just a second Moses. When I realized that the law was one thing and the gospel another, I broke through and was free. This is what he considered to be the great breakthrough of his own teaching. And in fact, I happen to agree. Because he talked to, Martin Luther wrote, he was unbelievably prolific. He wrote what he wrote about. vocation and what he wrote about this, the two kingdoms and the kingdom of the world and the kingdom of God. And what he wrote about just the nature of the Bible. He translated, the Bible into German, and it's the great, beautiful translation that really built the German language. What's known as Hochdeutsch or High German is Luther's German. He's like the Shakespeare as well. It turns out he was gifted not just as a homiletician or a preacher, but as a writer, and a poet almost. But this was the thing that he thought was the most important. Now, it may sound self-evident that there's a difference between the law that convicts, meaning do this, and you're immediately thought, have I done it? Or I didn't do it. And the gospel that frees, what God has done versus what I need to do. One is a command, one is a promise. But its importance cannot be overstated, not then and not now, because it does represent the key by which Luther unlocked the central teaching of the Christian faith, indeed of Christ himself, which is the forgiveness of sins and the justification of the sinner by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone. Now that's a bold statement, and it's not the only hermeneutic, it's not the only lens through which we can view Scripture, but it is one that has extreme power in my personal experience. It is the difference between going to church out of duty and going to church out of excitement and joy, and serving another person because I have to call them, and serving another person because I want to call them. For those the Europeans that understood it, it ignited everything, and it became something that they would die for. So, as the years went by, the distinction between the law and the gospel grew in prominence. It received its fullest and sort of most thorough expression in his commentary on Galatians. In that work, he goes as far as to say the distinction between law and gospel is the highest art in Christendom. Virtually the whole of the Scriptures and the understanding of the whole of theology depends on the true understanding of the law and the gospel. I mean, he was not soft-spoken. He was into hyperbole. But this is also why he inspired such devotion and such revulsion, because he would say things in a way that wasn't terribly qualified, or what's the modern word is nuanced. He would just say it, and you'd kind of be like, well, hold on, here's an exception. Anyway, today, this distinction between the law and the gospel, which was really upheld as the great breakthrough for a long time, it's gone in and out of fashion. And I'd say today, at the time of the 500th anniversary, it's not really in fashion. I talked to most of my friends. I'm not an ordained person, but it's not really taught in most seminaries. Luther, it's seen as almost like a theological curiosity, something to take off the shelf and kind of know about, but not something that really has much relevance or power in terms of 21st century preaching of the good news. So it's seen as it's quaint, it might be the right word for it. It's caricatured often as reductive and outmoded, a tight-fisted attempt to force a framework on the Bible that's alien to it. Everyone has a sort of some lens through which they view Scriptures, but this is one, and that sometimes people feel is too formulaic. Are you saying that this is either this verse is law and that verse is gospel? No, that is not what is going on here. The law and gospel hermeneutic, the law and gospel lens, the breakthrough, has not proven any more immune to abuse than any other great theological concept. Perversion, exaggeration. We tend to take a lot of the good gifts and maybe use them as weapons. That's sort of the history of humanity almost. But proponents have sometimes mistakenly given the impression that this distinction between the law and the gospel divides the Bible in half. Old Testament law, New Testament gospel. Old law, grace. That's not what it's about. Or that it dismisses whole books and chapters as strictly one or the other. in effect shackling the text and sucking the life out of it. And certainly maybe that has been true over the years. And some people, my grandfather, for example, grew up in German pietism in California. His grandfather was, his father was a German immigrant from the Rhineland, a Lutheran pastor. And the form of law and gospel that he encountered as a child was basically nothing but no. No. That's all you need to know. No. And what happened? He ran as far away as he could. He became an atheist scientist and worked for National Geographic for 35 years. And what did his son do? Became a Christian minister. So this is what the law... as we all know, when you're told no, when all you encounter is judgment from a parent or from a church, you react. And you react in a variety of ways. The law and gospel distinction has less to do with imposing a doctrinal straitjacket on the Bible text than engaging with the living God. If anything, reading the Bible through the lens of law and grace, law and gospel, it safeguards the Word from being read predominantly as an instruction manual. You know, I always get worried when I deal with college students, and we do Bible studies. And, there's a school of thought that just like if you just hand a kid a Bible, then God, he speaks through the Bible, and they'll just get great things out of it. I mean, but people who think that have never ever experienced a teenager. You pick it up, and all they will hear is either they'll laugh at the funny parts, or they will hear a list of rules. I got to do these things? No, thank you. Or I got to do these things? I'm going to work really, really hard. It's in fact, so Luther's trying to safeguard the Bible, or at least his breakthrough does, as a living instrument of the Spirit of God that proclaims God's work in the world on behalf of sinners in need of saving. It's a powerful explanation of how the Bible doesn't just sit there, that it reaches out and grasps you and shakes you and transforms you and frees you. It kills you and makes alive. Even so, Luther himself warned against what he saw as a propensity for turning a hermeneutic like this, which is just another word for lens, into a new law, into a new tool for sinners to try to establish control over Scripture and over God, which is, what the sort of original sin. How can I use this to my advantage? Rather than how can I hear from God the pardoning word, that I am loved as I am rather than as I should be. He even wrote, Luther said, there is no man living on earth who knows how to distinguish rightly between the law and the gospel. We may think we understand it when we are listening to a sermon, but we're far from it. Only the Holy Spirit knows this art. So for those willing to look beneath the surface, the vitality of this distinction remains undiminished. It has an immense capacity for breathing new life into a faith that can all too easily sink into complacency or exhaustion. In fact, despite its association with a specific historical moment, no approach to the Bible, in my contention, could be less esoteric or less archaic. Those who've experienced the difference between control and surrender, between criticism and acceptance, between hurt and forgiveness, between achievement and appeasement. If you've experienced the difference between the failure to love and the desire to be loved, aka if you have a pulse, you will not have a hard time grasping this distinction. It lies at the heart not just of Scripture, but of everyday life. So I'm going to spend the rest of this talk trying to outline to you what I think it means. So again, Luther believed that God has spoken to people primarily through two words, through law and gospel. They're distinct from one another, but they're not independent. The basic demarcation is straightforward. The law tells us what we ought to do, who we ought to be. The gospel tells us what God has done and who He is. The law shows us that we need to be forgiven. The gospel tells us that we have been forgiven. It announces it. The law paves the way for the gospel by revealing our plight And the gospel proclaims the good news to those struck down by the law, who are dealing with their failure to be what they would like to be or ought to be, which is pretty much everyone. So think about it. When most of us think of the law, we think of, in religious terms, we think of that the law of God, right? In our church, we have the Ten Commandments and the Lord's Prayer, and we have the Apostles' Creed on the tablets. The oughts and the ought nots that we find spelled out there. Maybe if you're a person who's more New Testament oriented, you think of the Sermon on the Mount, and you think about Jesus' commands, not to lust and not to be angry, where he equates anger with murder, he equates lust with adultery. And he also says that one of the ones that's always left out there, which is, I think, more damning, frankly, is where he says, do not worry. Have you tried it? Don't do it. Stop. It's true. Life would be a whole lot better if we didn't worry. And yet, who can stand up to that? Remember, it ends with Christ saying, therefore be perfect, as your Father in heaven is perfect. So that's the capital L law, and I believe it traces the shape of true holiness. And in doing so, when you're really confronted with the command, do not worry, what is your first thought? Worried. I'm worried. I'm worried now about how much I worried. What hope do I have? Or we say, be perfect. Oh, he was just exaggerating. He wasn't being serious. Do not lust. Well, how's the human race supposed to procreate? Oh, we're up the creek. But what it does, in Luther's understanding here, is that hearing the law, what it does is it reveals you and I to be stubborn, obstinate men and women, fundamentally turned away from the right choices, the proper feelings, the good life, indeed from God himself. Ultimately, the law brings humankind face to face with death, for it reveals our sin, and the wages of sin is death. But Luther recognized that the law also referred to a kind of overarching spiritual principle of life in the world. See, St. Paul talked about righteousness by works of the law, and he talked about it in other kind of, as like a principle, a sort of an elemental force that we all experience every hour of every day. It's present wherever we experience accusation and constraint and control and condemnation. The law, in this sense, is whatever it is you are relying upon to justify yourself. And for every person, it's going to be a little different. This does not mean that it is something holy, or you're aspiring to something holy. But it means that the law is at work on us, even when we're not hearing specific divine commands. It means that the law isn't so much its content, but its effect. It's how we hear it. The illustration I use in the magazine article is from Calvin and Hobbes, my favorite cartoon. Still mourning that it's off the air, as it were. You remember it, like Hobbes is the tiger, and he asked Calvin, who's 6 years old, he says, are you planning on making any New Year's resolutions? And do you remember how Calvin responds? Resolutions? Me? Just what are you implying? That I need to change? Well, buddy, as far as I'm concerned, I'm perfect the way I am. Although Hobbes has asked a simple question, Calvin hears an accusation, a.k.a. your personality could use a little work. The irony in the strip is that Calvin's reaction reveals just how much he is in need of improvement. He is hearing the law in a question. He's hearing a, you should be better than you are. Something about this question is triggering some wound in his conscience. And you know this from people. You know people you have to walk on eggshells around because they're going to interpret everything as a potential criticism, even when it's not meant to be. It's called marriage, I guess. Right? But it's how things often work. You hear a criticism in between the lines. Have you seen my keys, honey? What? I did not misplace your keys. What are you implying? I just can't find my keys. But, if you want to find the law at work, think about the person. If sometimes there are people that you write emails to, and it takes you 2 seconds. Sometimes there are people that you write emails to, and it takes you 2 days. If it takes 2 days, you're probably trying to say just the right thing that will get just the right result and no more. Meaning that person represents the law. That is what is making you so afraid. Language like if then often signals the law's presence. If you obey our rules, then you get dessert. But it cannot be boiled down to a grammatical formula. Depending on context, what one person hears as a prohibition, another hears as permission. Take, for example, a kid, and let's think of the health and wealth gospel. Do you know about the prosperity gospel? I'm sure you've heard of it. And what it often says to people is, if you work really hard, then God will bless you, and you will be happy, and you'll get money. That's what it means. If you do this, then you'll do that. And someone who is so afflicted by their conscience that maybe they've been working really hard and they haven't gotten anywhere, they hear that as, well, then God doesn't love me. But think about a kid who's grown up in a terrible situation with no money, and they hear, if you work hard, God will bless you. They might hear it as, me? God cares enough about me to care if I would be blessed? That you can hear things in different ways is what I'm trying to say. And so it's impossible to boil it down. That's all I'm really wanting to say there. But Luther said that the law is a constant guest in our conscience. You might say that the little l law, the lowercase law, is the air we breathe as human beings, the quid pro quo that characterizes both our internal life, our internal game of tennis that never stops, and much of our external one as well. Its underlying logic is embarrassingly familiar, and this is the logic of the law. To get approval, to get love, you have to achieve. You better perform. Behavior precedes belovedness. Climb the ladder, or else. No wonder the author of Hebrews tells us that the law is inscribed on the conscience. It seems to be the default, the most natural way of thinking. I'm no one if I'm not in that office, in that corner office. I'm no one. So we see this divine demand, by the way, because it gets a little confusing when I'm talking about capital L law, which is good and wonderful. And again, if we didn't worry, we would be better off. If we didn't lust and we weren't angry, it would be a much easier life to live. People wouldn't be acting out in all the terrible ways they act out. And yet, if this is truly as powerful a dynamic and as central a dynamic to the way that the human nature works, well then it will be echoed in all sorts of other ways in the conscience. And I would say if it's really our default setting, well then people who are in marketing are going to take advantage of it, right? And they do. Because maybe, the woman on the street may not have given the 5th chapter of the Sermon on the Mount a second thought since she was 6 years old. Yet she is likely on intimate terms with the condemning echoes issuing from Madison Avenue. Thou shalt be skinny. Thou shalt be successful. Thou shalt be independent. Thou shalt be self-actualized. Or else. If you want to have love, if you want to be valued, well then you need to be like this. And you're not like that, so buy this product. This is how there's an instinctual understanding of this in anyone who's doing anything kind of economic work. She may have long since, you and I may have long since grown accustomed to that internalized voice of a demanding parent, that feeling of never quite being enough, which drives so much of our striving. That woman, in other words, is just like you and me. In this light, it's odd, I'd say, that the secular world, the world outside the church, is viewed as an escape from the moral strictures of religion. Maybe you've got someone in your family who says, enough of church, that's no fun. I want to go out here and really enjoy myself. But anyone who spent any time at all in New York City knows that Madison Avenue, the secular world, the corporate ladder, can be just as condemning and judgmental, if not more so, than any religious ladder. You know, thou shalt, but you go even beyond that. Go out to Portland, you know, where the dream of the 90s is still alive. People, a lot of kids who lived in Richmond live out in Portland right now, you know, or they live in Jackson Hole. And what you find, you go out there, they've just replaced it with a different set of laws. But the underlying logic, if you want belovedness, if you want to be accepted, you must fit into this mold. You must be the most green, the most sustainable. And one of the ways to do that is to make sure that those other people who are less than you know it in that particular way. That's what the show Portlandia, if anyone's watched it. The whole thing is about that. It's about people go to Portland and they think they're free and they've constructed this sort of hippie garden, and they find that it's just as judgmental, they're just using different bases for judgment. And they all want to leave. But they don't, because they don't have any money. I think the law, thou shalt be authentic, that's a word you hear a lot in our culture. Just be authentic. Tell that to a 17-year-old. What? I have no idea who I am. How can I be authentic? You know, there's a New Yorker cartoon of a father talking to his son right outside the college admissions office. He says, son, you know, just be the version of yourself that will get you into this college. So that is actually a shifting, it's a crueler taskmaster than thou shalt not bear false witness. That's a little easier to grab a hold of, right? I know what that means, I just shouldn't lie. I can't do either of those things, but you know, I'm already lying by the time I finish the sentence. But the latter has at least the benefit of not being a moving target, constantly changing with the cultural wind, because what's the cultural sort of imperative on you and your children or your generation is different than the generation behind you. It's going to be different from the one behind you. But what will remain static is the fact that there's an imperative, and no one feels like they've met it. And that we're all going through life and feeling like we're behind the ball, and everyone else has it together but us. Their family is so happy, but mine is a total mess, or if they only knew. Take one other one today, and this is just, the law it's fun to talk about because it's a point of connection with the rest of the human race. Busyness, right? Anyone here busy? When asked how we were doing, we used to say, I'm fine. Or if you're in the Midwest, I'm not bad. Or I'm pretty good. Today, how are you doing busy? I'm crazy busy. I just am my head's spinning, and I can't even believe I'm answering your question right now. That's how busy I am. Excuse me, I need to take this phone call. Because we're not lying. It's not as though we're lying. Smartphones and other devices have chased away whatever idleness used to exist. You know, very rarely do you go into a doctor's office, and even a doctor's office like a heart doctor, and where most of the demographic would be over the age of 60, they're not sitting there. You know, the people that signed up for Facebook the most last year, you know who it was? Age 70 and older. And all their other kids have left because they're on Snapchat now. Inversely proportional. But busyness is more than a description of how we're doing. It's our cultural predominant indicator of worth and value. It's a measure of personal righteousness. The more frantic the activity, the better. And the implication is always, if you're not overoccupied, you're inferior to those who are. I mean, what does it say about you if you're not busy? How are you doing? Well, I'm just sort of hanging out. You know, just having a good day. I think I might watch some TV later. You know, no one says that. Because it's unacceptable to say that. Unless you're you've made peace with being a deadbeat. As with all law-based barometers of self-worth, beauty, wealth, influence, youth, there's no enough. This is the logic inside. There's no enough. Think about it. What the near universal obsession with busyness reveals is that everyone is religious. They're including the secular world. While I don't really believe in a secular world. It's not just those who believe in God that are religious. Works righteousness, trying to get approval by your own, achievements, by your own attributes. That is something we're all doing. In that sense, we're all worshiping. We're justifying ourselves. We're all worshiping something. What does Bob Dylan say? You're going to have to serve somebody. And he goes through all the things people serve. So the law reigns over all creation. The question is not if, but which form a person subscribes to. And once you find out what law a person is operating under, it's very easy to manipulate them. It's very easy. But whatever its form, the law is never able to bring about what it calls for. This is a key part of the whole shebang here. This is St. Paul, this is Martin Luther, this is St. Augustine. Much as we wish it were not the case, telling people what they should do does not give them or us the power to do it. And again, anyone who's had children knows this is true. But it's true for you too. In fact, the law tends to create the very thing it seeks to avoid. Banning a book is often a triumph for its marketing. You ever told someone to just relax? Has it worked? There's that great Bob Newhart skit where a woman comes into, he's planning a shrink, and a woman comes into his office and says, Bob, I just have such a hard time with, stop it! What? I didn't even say it. Stop it! What? I'm really, stop it! Stop it! Oh, okay. And then she leaves. We think that yelling stop it at the people in our lives, in creative and maybe implicit in the subtext, is going to get them to do it. And it never has, it never will, because it's the law. The law does not, it can describe what you should do, stop it, but it cannot give you the power to do it. It will only make you what it is to do. It makes you more aware of the fact that you can't do it. Stop being so anxious, Mom. You stop calling me all the time. Stop worrying. Or, Dad, stop drinking. Doesn't work. I wish it did. The law increases the trespass, is how St. Paul puts it in Romans chapter 5, verse 20. The world of social media, of course, and when I look at you, I think you all, I no longer have to sort of explain what Facebook is. It's, it's like, it's a permanent high school reunion, is what it is. And if my father ever told me anything, he said, never, ever, ever go to a high school reunion. Why do you say that, Dad? It was because he read a lot of Martin Luther. You're going to be excited about how much higher above the ladder you are than that guy, and you'll feel terrible about how well-preserved she still is, right? It's all just one big ladder. And the fact that you came from the same place, that ties you to them on the ladder. So you can't rationalize it as easily, the fact that you put on, the tire that you had put on. But think about the world of social media. It's tailor-made for illustrations of both how the law of who you must be manifests itself and how counterproductive those manifestations are. This is the world in which we live. This is why the 500th anniversary of the Reformation is such a no-brainer for those of us who are in church work. We spend all our time editing our personalities online, making sure that only the good stuff shows. What are we getting? We're trying to get the hoped-for response from other people, which is affirmation and attention. And yet, if and when that response actually comes, it feels hollow because we know that what they're liking is not actually us. It's no surprise that every single social scientist, it's like they're shouting, stop it. Everything you read on, in the Atlantic Monthly is saying that the more time you spend on social media, the happier you perceive your friends to be and the sadder you feel as a consequence. Really? Everyone else feels that way? Yes, everyone else feels that way. But that's what's so devious about it. Of course, then why do we continue? Why do we like the law so much? If it is so patently obvious and you can laugh at it, well, why? Because we like the law because it promises us domain, it promises us control, and there's nothing we like more than control. My definition of original sin is simply that we're all control freaks. Right? We're all addicted to control addicts. If I can just do X, Y, or Z, then I will get the result I want. If I can just be this kind of person or project those qualities publicly, well, then I will be loved. But people who are addicted to control, which is all of us, if you've been to the airport recently, or on I-64, they're addicted to the law as a means of control. And the sad irony of all of our lives is that our desire to be in control ends up controlling us. The law, in this sense, is a fatal attraction. Our desire to be in control ends up controlling us. So here we have this law which says what you should do, but no one follows it perfectly. Not the little L laws, the cruel and arbitrary ones of society, not the capital L law ones of God. Just read the rich young ruler in Mark chapter 10. I mean, how else do you account for the fact that the most accomplished people you know feel more rather than less pressure to succeed? The most beautiful people you know feel uglier than anyone. I just ask it. You'll find some form of frustration if you talk to the person in town who's the biggest giver at the church. Okay, no one's aware of that. I know, right? We all are very aware of these things, but you will hear some form of frustration over the truth that the higher you climb, the longer the ladder that gets. There is a double bind at work. It's like a husband pointing out the dishes he's done in order to leverage some gratitude from his wife. The second you harness your good deeds for credit is the second they become less good. Right? It's not that doing the dishes is a bad thing. It's actually great. Husbands, serve your wives. This is wonderful if we all did the dishes for each other. And yet the second I need credit for it, I need my score to go up on the spreadsheet so that maybe later, you're dead in the water. There's no enough. They become less good. My wife is always like, well, if you had me to do a whole song and dance about how you unloaded the dishwasher, I wish you just hadn't done it. Well, the only reason I was doing it is so I can get credit. Not surprisingly, relationships that are characterized primarily by the law, in other words, pleasing, scorekeeping, they bite the dust. It's a great book called Mistakes Were Made, But Not By Me, by someone we've interviewed, a social psychologist named Carol Tavris and Elliot Aronson. And they describe how a fixation on righteousness can choke the life out of love. The vast majority of couples, they report, who drift apart do so slowly, over time, in a snowballing pattern of blame and self-justification. Each partner focuses on what the other one is doing wrong while justifying his or her own preferences, attitudes, and ways of doing things. From our standpoint, therefore, misunderstandings, conflicts, personality differences, and even angry quarrels are not the assassins of love. Self-justification is. Scorekeeping. The law. A misuse of the law. Thinking that if I just tell this person to do or be, they can do it. What's the gospel then? Because there's good news here. Well, the second word gospel does mean good news. And news is not command. Command comes in an imperative voice, do this. News comes in an indicative voice, this has been done. This has happened. For Christians, the good news is entirely bound up with this Jesus Christ character, who died and rose again, who took the whole of God's wrath upon himself, setting you and I free. The gospel announces that on account of Christ's death and resurrection, we are justified by grace through faith. In other words, our standing before God is not according to what we do or by even who we are, but by what Christ has done and who he is. It is a gift with no strings attached, because any time you have a gift with strings attached, it's not a gift, it's a Trojan horse, or it's a wage. Our guilt has been atoned for. The deepest judgment, the thou shalt, the should, that the law reveals, it has been satisfied. And we have been reconciled to God, to a holy God, given life eternal. This is the great gospel message we read in the lectionary a couple weeks ago. For if while we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to him through the death of his Son, how much more, having been reconciled, shall we be saved through his life? So while the law is conditional, the gift of Christ is unconditional. And like any great gift, it's a surprise. It's unbidden. It's unprovoked. It is a Savior given to those who don't deserve one. This is what Christmas is about. This is why it's so fitting that we give gifts, and why it's so sad that we turn the Santa elf on the shelf thing into like a new form of slave labor. I'm kidding. I love Santa. But I preached about how the elf on the shelf was bad one day. About how it's like Big Brother, with little kids, and it's like it's all about do this and you'll get that. It's rather than like Jesus Christ coming to the dark world that welcomed him not. And half the parents in the congregation complained. And then later on, but I really got my just desserts when my kids insisted that we get an elf on the shelf. So I'm eating humble pie, and I'm the chief of sinners. So if you look at Jesus Christ, his affection could not be leveraged or merited. He simply gave. He gave his attention, his power, his very self, and he gave to the wrong people. In that cross, the all-encompassing love of God speaks louder than that voice of condemnation. The gospel overwhelms the law. I've come not to abolish the law, but fulfill it. This is Jesus himself speaks in these terms. But much like the capital L law and the little L forms of law, there's a corollary between the capital G gospel of Jesus Christ and the little g grace in human affairs. We see this borne out in our own lives and the lives of other people. Your own life, my own life. I mean, when it comes to lifting the human spirit, nothing is more potent than love in the midst of deserved judgment. Nothing. Which is grace. Grace proves time and again to be the force that inspires creativity and service and hope and vulnerability and new life. Does anyone here watch Downton Abbey? Did anyone here watch Downton Abbey? Okay, I have to use this example because it's a great example, but you remember Daisy. Anyone want to tell us who Daisy was? Who was Daisy? She was the kitchen help. She was the ditzy kitchen help who was sweet and extremely lovable, but a little simple-minded perhaps, right? We liked her, and we've been rooting for her. And ever since the series begins, she's clumsy, and she's always in kind of conversation with this guy, William, who's this boyish footman who clearly holds a candle for her. And for much of the first season of the show, she doesn't give him the time of day. But ever so slowly, his sweet demeanor wears her down, and she warms towards him, right? Not to the point where she reciprocates his feelings, but certainly to the point where she is no longer avoiding his advances. When William enlists in the British Army, it's World War I, and asks Daisy to marry him, she cannot bring herself to say no. She knows that she's not quite there romantically, but the last thing she wants is for him to go to the front with a broken heart. And so with a conflicted conscience, she consents to the engagement. William, spoiler alert, you've had plenty of time to watch it. He suffers a fatal injury and is brought back home, where the house rallies to fulfill his dying wish, which is that he and Daisy would get married. And so they do. And it happens a few hours before he succumbs to his wounds. Daisy, though, is deeply reluctant about the whole affair because she cannot summon the callousness to assert herself. Am I out of time?
No, you're fine.
Okay. So in the wake of William's death, his father, he dies. His father, the lonely and sort of grieving Mr. Mason, reaches out to Daisy, his son's bride, in the hopes of establishing some kind of relationship. You tracking with me? Okay. Daisy is just completely honest. That's what we love about her. She kind of can't tell a lie, and she's got this overactive conscience. And she's plagued with guilt and regret, and so she runs away. She avoids Mr. Mason, even though he looks like the sweetest man you've ever seen. But she can't avoid him forever, and eventually she accepts an invitation to tea at his humble dwelling. And the following scene ensues. I'll read it to you. Daisy, you shouldn't have gone to all this trouble. Not for me. I don't deserve it. Not when I was only married to William for a few hours. Mr. Mason says, you may not know this, Daisy, but William had 3 brothers and a sister, all dead at birth, or not long after. I think that's one reason why William married you, so that I wouldn't be alone. Without you, I'd have no one to pray for. I think William knew that. So, will you be my daughter? Let me take you into my heart, make you special. You'll have parents of your own, of course. I haven't any parents, not like that. I've never been special to anyone. Well, except William. Daisy. That's right, I was only ever special to William. Never thought of it like that before. Mr. Mason looks at her and says, well, now you're special to me. What's happened here? Daisy has done everything she can to stiff-arm Mr. Mason. She has clung with all her strength to an understanding of love as quid pro quo. That you cannot receive love from someone that you don't love equally first. You have to be... For Daisy, as for many of us, love is a matter of emotional righteousness, of this feeling in exchange for that feeling, and it blurs her vision. She is entirely caught up with her perception of the situation. And when Daisy finally catches a glimpse of how she is perceived, first by William and consequently by his father, the scales fall from her eyes. What she thought was going on and what was actually going on were 2 different things. In other words, Mr. Mason is not relating to her on the basis of her feelings or her emotional righteousness, but that of his son's. And on that basis, he wants to adopt her. Now that's about as uncanny an illustration of God's grace as we could hope to find on network television. That God relates to you and me not according to our feelings or our attributes that we bring to the table. The checklist, the emotional, the circumstantial, the accomplishment checklist we need to fulfill. He relates to us on the basis of those that his Son brought to the table. As a result, we are adopted as children. This is the language of the New Testament, adoption. We receive the same benefit, care, inheritance, love as the Son. And it's profoundly good news. And it's no coincidence that Daisy's final scene of the season finds her standing up for herself in a way that we could never have imagined beforehand. In fact, her change in status from orphan to daughter leads to another change in status as she becomes a cook's assistant. In other words, the theological word is imputed, belovedness bears fruit almost immediately. And what else do we find? We find that William, one of the reasons he wanted to marry her so badly is that she would get a pension for the rest of her life as an officer's widow. She had no idea. Gratuity upon gratuity. I'm not sure Downton Abbey was aiming to present a Christian allegory here. They were simply trying to tell a story in a believable way that actually touched your heartstrings. But again, the closer the culture gets to reality, the closer it gets to truth, especially when it deals with things that heal people and change them. So a grace-centered view of the world takes for granted that we are all severely handicapped in our ability to love one another, and that we stand a better chance of loving our neighbor or our spouse when we aren't looking to them to do or to be something that they cannot do or be. Christian hope does not lie in having to generate love on our own steam, but in prior belovedness expressed in sacrificial terms and in spite of undeserving. That kind of love is by definition divine, and it seeks out the unlovable, and it finds before it is found. It satisfies rather than introduces expectations. If the law commands, therefore, that we love perfectly, love God with all your heart, mind, strength, neighbor as yourself, gospel announces that we are perfectly loved. This runs directly counter to a culture where technology has made our every misstep and lapse in judgment searchable and permanent. Again, you don't have to be an ex-con to find yourself beholden to a rap sheet long after the infraction has been committed, long after the debt has been paid. They're out there for anyone on the internet to find. I, like my friend once described, the internet as just like the real world, but with all the forgiveness vacuumed out. Politicians talk of the right to be forgotten, especially in Europe, they talk about that. And we wonder if it could ever be possible among a score-keeping, credit-seeking species. And the bad news is that it's not. But the good news is that what is impossible with man is possible with God. So ultimately, if the world is truly as merciless a place as it appears, then Christians do not have to work very hard to make the notion of justification by faith, in other words, of unassailable righteousness received as a gift independent of merit, we do not have to work very hard to make that sound appealing. Removed, replaced with freedom. The freedom to die and yet live, to fail and yet succeed. The freedom to love, to serve, to wait, to laugh, to cry, to sit idle, to get busy, yes, even to play, especially with toys like that. Thank you. Tell me what time we got. I want to respect the, what?
8:15.
8:15. Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry I spoke so long. We have 5 minutes for questions. What?
I said, who would notice?
5 minutes for questions?
Sure.
Yeah, Matt.
You talked about Luther having that moment of, when it hits him, the gospel finally hits him. When was that moment for you? But I'm trying, when was that moment for you?
It was a moment that I felt this was real, or true, a Luther moment. Well, you can never really hear the gospel from your parents for whatever reason. God has programmed us that way. Maybe some people have, but you sort of have to find your father figure elsewhere. I would say it's bound up in my own testimony for becoming a Christian, which has to do with finding out firsthand that I knew what I should do and I wasn't doing it. I knew I needed to extract myself from a painful relationship that was really breaking my heart and laying me out to just manipulation and all sorts of bad things. But I couldn't act in that way. Nothing I could do it. And the only thing that worked, or that what I don't know if it worked. This is just how it happened. Is I prayed and I was delivered from something that I couldn't do myself. And then you kind of look back, and I had a brother who dealt with a lot of addiction issues, and so the older you get, the more you're disillusioned about your own capabilities, for good, and the more you kind of come to terms with who you actually are rather than who you thought you should be or could be. And the only word of comfort I heard was this message of grace. And so it was either that or like Hiroshima. So it was. I remember the moments. I can remember it, but I think this is also something we need to hear. We forget this. We're so programmed for the law. Everything the world is shouting at us, and we're shouting at ourselves, the ghosts of our dead parents, is more, faster, better, different. Whatever it is, that voice of imperative that we come to church. I need to have this Lutheran moment like every week, and so I have I feel like I'm able to be in a church where I get to hear that absolution. And I think that's one of the great gifts of the Book of Common Prayer, is that you can't get through Rite 1 and Rite 2 without being absolved of your sins. And I know some churches do different things with the confession of sin, but that's my favorite part. And the absolution. The comfortable words. Anything else?
How long are your classes?
in my classes with my students.
Yeah.
Well, I actually don't teach classes. I'm a licensed lay preacher in the Diocese of Virginia. I don't know if he mentioned that, but I have a license to preach. Bishop Shannon. So I actually don't teach. I teach Sunday school, and I do lots of. We have a big active student congregation. I do lots of small groups and things like that. But most of my work is with Mockingbird, frankly. And so we do conferences, and we have one coming up in New York at the end of the month, end of April. So we do podcasts, we do books.
You said what your students were telling you. I just wondered what the student base was.
The student base is just the 300 kids from the University of Virginia that come to our Sunday evening service.
Oh, okay.
And so I get the, what is it, the scuttlebutt. I hear what's going on campus, on grounds, excuse me. Anything else? Well, thanks for listening. I hope maybe the Reformation sounds a little more interesting. A lot of this stuff is all drawn from this book, Law and Gospel, that myself and two friends wrote. And we try to make the same connections in a pithy and brief way, briefer than the long talk I just gave.
Thank you.
Thank you.